Good morning, everyone. Good morning, David Brancaccio. Hi, Doug. Nice to see you again. And God, I'm really sorry we're not actually in that Opera House in Camden, which was lovely the last time I was there, despite everything being snowed into the gills. And I'm reminded, as you were saying, David, that the last time I was there was to talk about relations with Russia and, well, how things have changed, right? 2015, that was the February after the Russian illegal annexation of Crimea. And it seems as though a circle is closing now with a Russian invasion in Ukraine and a truly unparalleled transatlantic coming together of an effort to both support Ukraine, deter Russia and Putin, and reassure and defend NATO allies. As you said, David, I used to be a journalist, and I have covered transatlantic security issues and German foreign and security policy, European as well, ever since being sent to Somalia as an intern, where the Germans sent their sort of for the second time after the fall of the wall, after having sent a handful of medics, I think, to Cambodia in '92, they sent a brigade to Somalia, which ended up pretty much guarding itself in the desert outside Beledweyne. But we've come a long way since then. And I have to say, this is literally the worst, the most consequential, and the most terrifying, not just transatlantic crisis, not just European crisis, but really crisis for global order that I have ever encountered. I mean, we are dealing with a clear aggressor who has lied to us, has insulted us, lied and insulted to, and lied to and insulted Ukraine, and is now attempting to change the government in Ukraine, all the while attacking not just the Ukrainian military, but Ukrainian civilian dwellings and defenseless people in Ukraine. There are hundreds of thousands, I don't know exactly how, I'm not sure anybody has the exact number, of innocent Ukrainians on the move, fleeing inside the country and across its borders. 100,000, I think, have already arrived across the borders in Poland. The International High Commissioner for Refugees in Geneva is speaking of a potential 5 million refugees that might leave Ukraine in the coming days. At the same time, we are seeing Ukrainians and the Ukrainian government putting up a truly heroic defense of their country and of the capital city, Kyiv. And I have to say, they're really putting everybody to shame who thought, and that appears to include Mr. Putin himself, that the Ukrainian resistance would be zero or would just wilt in the face of a determined Russian onslaught. Doug will probably say more about this, but it seems to me that we have all underestimated the Ukrainian military and Ukrainian civic spirit. And perhaps also we've slightly overestimated the preparedness of the Russian military. It's really quite astonishing. There's a great deal to say there, but I'll leave that to Doug and talk a little bit now, if I may, about what I see happening in the alliance space from a European perspective, being a German who's lived in Washington for the past 8 years. I arrived there, in fact, at the height of the Ukraine crisis in late 2014. And, you know, I've just come back from the Munich Security Conference, which was this time last weekend. And I've been going to Munich security conferences since my earliest days as a journalist. So sadly, and this, I know this dates me, for longer than 20 years. And the handful of Munich security conferences before the onset of the pandemic, when they stopped or turned virtual for a while, were pretty depressing affairs. Because in fact, one of those conferences, I believe it was in 2018 or 19, was titled Westlessness, because it appeared that neither the government of the previous president nor European governments were able to muster any form of political defense, much less economic and military, against a rising tide of authoritarianism around the world, not just in Russia, but also in China and elsewhere. And at the same time, a rising tide of populism at home. So it seemed as though we were losing the battle for democracy and a rules-based international order, both at home and in the international arena. And those conferences were as depressing as I have seen at any time. Whereas this one, I have to say, was completely different. And I had also made a trip, my first in the pandemic, because I, as a German non-US passport holder, was subject to the travel ban, so I couldn't leave the country for a while. But I did go to Berlin in November and December, so I wasn't completely surprised. And I remember being before Christmas, people saying to me who were already then working very closely together with the National Security Council and the White House on designing potential sanctions for the case of a Russian aggression against Ukraine. I remember these people saying the Americans are consulting us like never before. They're working with us like never before. And we have to rise to the occasion, but this is going to be really, really hard. But, it is the worst security crisis. This is what people literally said to me in my professional experience. And so I was not really surprised, Frank, to be honest with you. Also because I have always thought that Putin needed to be taken seriously. And the point where I thought, okay, this is going to happen, he will attack, and he's not just going to go for a chunk of Ukraine or only Ukraine, was when the Kremlin sent those two quote unquote draft treaties to the White House and NATO in the days before Christmas. And those drafts can only be characterized as maximalist ultimata of a nature that they were essentially non-starters, particularly given the rhetoric they were accompanied by. Some of you will remember Russian Foreign Minister Ryabkov saying, as far as we're concerned, these can be signed on Saturday, no changes necessary. And since then, the West has made one offer of dialogue after the other. We have offered to talk about missiles, about troop deployments, about exercises, confidence building measures. All of those have been rejected. Putin, we have sent one state leader after another to the Kremlin. Putin stood next to them, said that he was willing to dialogue, told lies, and then the Kremlin speaker the next day would say that offer of dialogue is non-existent. And now we have this unprecedented invasion. And it seems to me, on the whole, and then I'll stop with that consideration, because I'm sure many of you will have questions and I want to hear what Doug has to say. It seems to me that we are providing an unexpectedly, remarkably united front, which I think has surprised the Kremlin. And while my own country, Germany, and this new government, which represents a new political generation in Germany, these are no longer the folks who came into political maturity with the fall of the wall. This is the German 9/11 generation. And while they are clearly following something of a visible learning trajectory, this government is actually doing a fairly remarkable job at this point. And that includes, I'll make a personal exception, unfortunately, for the German defense minister, but everybody else, I think, is completely in sync here. And I would just end by saying that I've just seen on Twitter that the German chancellor has said that we are now sending 1,000 anti-tank weapons and 500 Stingers to Ukraine, thereby ending Germany's policy, which has angered many of our allies, of not sending weapons into crisis zones. I'm very grateful for that. I'm happy for it, but there are other things that still need to happen in the realm of sanctions, in the realm of deterrence and defense. And I look forward to discussing those with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Doug, you want to take it over?
Sure, thanks. First, it's good to be with the Camden team and with CONSTANZE again on a virtual stage, I suppose. I think there's a tendency when we face such significant change in our lives, right? Whether it's our personal lives or in this case, sort of the global perspective, that there's an early instinct to underestimate exactly the impact of what we're experiencing, right? We're almost too close to it. I would offer that Russia's attack of Ukraine over the last week will, in the end of the day, rival 9/11 for geostrategic impact. I think it will actually exceed the impacts of 9/11. And this is not to downplay 9/11 or the 20-year aftermath of 9/11. After all, we as Americans have just sort of, at least temporarily, closed one chapter of that with the withdrawal from Afghanistan. But and clearly for Americans, 9/11 will always be a signature event. And it's only the second time in our history, actually, that we were attacked by an external force on our territory, right? So this is very close and personal for Americans. But in terms of geostrategic impact, I think this is bigger. And here's why. It's widely appreciated that we are in a competition between the liberal, democratic, market-based world order and an authoritarian alternative, right? Most of us imagined, most of the expert opinion, most of the academic work has opined that this would play out over decades, right? And you'd see sort of a give and take across these lines between rulers like Presidents Putin and Xi and others in the Western world. And you'd see a mix of competition and cooperation, and it would play out as though it were a long, slow burning fuse, right? Well, with President Putin's invasion of Ukraine, that fuse has now exploded. And the competition that we imagined that would be sort of gentle and gradual and play out over a long period of time has exploded on us. And we are in a knife fight. The outcome of Ukraine, I think, will dramatically flavor the rest of the international system for the rest of our lives. Now, and I don't think that's an overstatement. Very important from the American perspective will be the impacts that this fight has on our looming competition with China. So you see China, I think China's still sort of trying to figure out how it's going to play on this. I thought very interesting. Constance mentioned that she was at the Munich Security Conference, and maybe the most quotable quote coming out of Munich last week was from, of all people, the Chinese foreign minister, who said something, and here I'm paraphrasing, China respects territorial integrity and national sovereignty, and Ukraine is no exception, he said, or something like that, right? So that seemed to suggest that in fact, China had interests in line with the existing international order. Now, since then, Chinese officials have gone out and sort of modified that and sort of walked back from that. And if anything, the President Xi, President Putin meeting at the opening of the Winter Olympics in Beijing suggested that they were in total partnership. Well, it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. But what you have are essentially those two authoritarian poles and the rest of us clustered together. And Ukraine represents the front line of that geostrategic competition. So as we talk today, I'm sure we'll bounce into the tactics of what's going on in Ukraine and so forth. We'll talk about its impact on European relations, on bilateral American-Russian relations, on relations inside the NATO community. But I think there's a broader and perhaps at the end of the day, more significant and dramatic impact on the global scene. We will be living with the aftermath of what's happening in Ukraine for the rest of our lives.
Yes, totally agree.
So on the anniversary of the Biden administration's first year in office, which is some weeks ago, right? January, there were some articles written about, so how's the US-European relationship doing? And the general sense I was getting from my perusal of the literature is that the Europeans were mildly encouraged by progress since the Trump administration, but that it hadn't been a revolutionary change, that many European leaders were waiting for something more significant to cement the relationship and move it more briskly back to maybe what it used to be. And that hadn't quite happened yet. Do you think this will do it, or is doing it as we speak?
Whom are you asking?
Constanze, I'll start with you.
Sure,
I'll
I'll
go to Doug.
start and then hand over to Doug. It's true. The previous administration traumatized a lot of people. It traumatized the Europeans especially, and no country more than my own, Germany, because it was obvious that the previous president had a very special animus against Germany and against its Chancellor Angela Merkel, right? That's a little bit hard to overlook. And and then people watched the election, looked at the polarization of America, said, this was a tight squeeze, and whatever happens, we need to hedge against this reverting to the previous state. I think that's the analysis here. And some people still think that. I think there's a concern that the polarization in America is so structural. And certainly if you look at, January 6th and where things have been going on the GOP side, I understand why people would be worried. You can also be worried, frankly, about some of the excesses, on the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. But it's the kind of sort of extreme division between the political ends that you saw in Europe in my childhood, and that you always thought, or I always thought, America wasn't capable of. So that's what, for better or for worse, is what people have at the back of their minds. And then, of course, in the summer, you had, for the foreign and security policy tribe like Doug and me, you had the withdrawal from Afghanistan and the extraction, of people from Kabul, and you had the AUKUS deal, all of which, seemed to suggest that this administration hadn't found its footing yet, wasn't quite sure, whether European allies were worth taking seriously. And I think that really reinforced concerns. And what we're seeing now, truly remarkably, and I would say that I am, a number of my colleagues have joined the administration, and the Biden administration has also made a complete 180-degree turnaround in terms of how it consults not just its European allies, but also media and think tanks, me belonging to the latter groups. The NSC does, briefings like 2 or 3 times a week for think tankers, and asks for advice and answers questions, which is truly remarkable. I have never seen that happen. Certainly didn't happen during the Obama administration. And so and I have had this confirmed to me, not just by German diplomats and people in the security apparatus whom I know, but also other Europeans whom I saw in Munich. This is a genuinely unique moment in transatlantic cooperation and consultation. It's not to say we don't have policy differences, but those policy differences are, for the most part, not about the principles. They're not about the framing. They're not about the analysis. They're about, although I will say, Europeans hung back a little bit on the imminence intelligence. We can talk about that. But about, I think, very legitimate technical details of, for example, with sanctions, what triggers sanctions, what aggression level does that, what's a proportional response, and what should the appropriate sequencing be. And again, I'm seeing a lot of those being resolved, through the usual means of discussion and then, just getting it out the door. That all is really quite remarkable. And I would say I see 2 reasons for that, if I may, and then I'll stop. One is, in a universe where the president of the United States says, we're not sending American sons and daughters to Ukraine to fight. It's not an Article 5 case. And what we are going to do instead is use economic tools like sanctions and export controls to deter and punish the Russian leadership. the partnership with the EU or with the Europeans becomes not, a sort of legitimizing, nice to have add-on, but actually essential to the operation. In fact, I would go one step farther and say it was clear from the beginning that because the American economy is so much less exposed to the Russian economy than we are, and particularly Germany's and Italy's, the burden, this would actually be a case of genuine burden sharing. In fact, the burden between America and Europe is asymmetrical, and we're bearing most of it, to be honest. That's not to say that you're not doing important things by sending military deterrents to the 82nd Airborne and other things to the NATO's eastern flank that we don't have in that quality and quantity and should have. But that has been, in other words, the roles in the transatlantic relationship in this specific instance have been somewhat reversed, and the Europeans have found themselves, somewhat surprisingly, being given a great deal of responsibility for this. And so far, I think they've, mostly, if somewhat belatedly, risen to the occasion.
So, Doug.
So I would just add a bit of additional texture on Afghanistan and the contrast between the first 6 months or 8 months of the Biden administration and then these more recent months. It's, first of all, the combination of these two foreign policy challenges in the first year of a new administration is almost breathtaking, especially in a bureaucracy and in the executive branch, which is still suffering from undermanning. Because we don't have all our assistant secretaries in position and so forth. So it's still a bit of a team that's in formation, right? But in this first year, like it or not, they face these two significant challenges. Afghanistan, which they inherited obviously from the Trump administration, and now Ukraine. In the case of Afghanistan, I visited NATO headquarters early in the year, and there was significant angst about the way the deal with the Taliban had been struck in February of 2020, so in the last year of the Trump administration, right? Even to the extent that allies were citing that they couldn't get a copy of the text of the agreement, which the United States had signed with the Taliban, while, of course, the Taliban had the agreement. And while the American allies had been with us largely since September 12th, 2001, so for 20 years in Afghanistan, but they thought very much that the United States had dealt about them without them and presented them a fait accompli by way of this withdrawal agreement that President Trump signed. When President Biden, now in office this last spring, affirmed that the United States would largely abide by that Trump agreement, they likewise felt under-consulted. That was then amplified again during the flawed execution of the withdrawal. So you had sort of a 1-2-3 punch that really struck to the question you posed, David, which is, how are transatlantic relations, and what do transatlantic relations mean if you can't even get the text of an agreement that affects our European allies? I think that we have to give credit to this administration for bouncing back from that Afghan experience, because as Constance outlined, they have done, I have never seen anything in my professional life like the diplomatic surge of the last sort of 2 months centered on Ukraine. And it's not only been persistent, it's been broad, it's been deep, it's been unrelenting. It has featured very prominently, it has featured the trust-building element of sharing intelligence and then exposing that intelligence publicly. In other words, we're so confident about our intelligence, we're not only going to share it among the 30 allies of NATO, we're going to tell you that we're sharing it with you, and then we're going to tell you that we propose to share this publicly to disclose Putin's false flag operations, his phony pretext for war in advance in an effort to disarm him. That's a level of consultation that I never saw in my 4 years as the U.S. ambassador to NATO. So I really give Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, the Biden team really strong grades for the way they rebounded from the summer and have demonstrated that they've got it. And the thing that they, I think, have most fundamentally reaffirmed the vital nature of transatlantic relations. I think not only in dealing with this sort of European-focused attack in Ukraine, but the transatlantic relationship as the pivot point, as the fulcrum with which to deal with China. So I think coming out of the Ukraine crisis, and it by the way, it's going to play out over months and months, so that we're going to be with this for some time. But coming out of this, what we will know for sure, and we will have reminded ourselves, is that the transatlantic relationship really is the start point for American involvement anywhere in the world. And in particular, it is the start point for American competition with China.
We had a speaker this morning who was talking about a lot of things, the future of the European economy, his view that Europe may end up taking the lead on developing green technology, that the US may be held back in the coming 10 years by domestic politics. That was one view. But he argued forcefully that Europe is going to have to increase its military investments, given what has now happened. Do you actually see that as a practical matter happening in Europe in the medium term?
So maybe I can start on that one, Constance. So look, the reality is that after the end of the Cold War and the breakup of the Soviet Union, European defense investment took a break. They took a peace dividend. I mean, there's no question about that. The data shows it very clearly. The US took some by recovering many of its troops out of Europe, but not completely. But when you compare the two, what you see is the US sort of sustained its defense capability and the Europeans essentially took a dividend, right? And they, look, for good reason. I mean, the Soviet Union had broken up. I mean, and if you look at the environment in the 90s, there'd be a reason to question why the Europeans would stay as well armed as they had been for the previous decades. The reality is that situation, this disparity between US defense capability and European defense capability, resulted after decades in the US spending about 70% of the total defense spending inside the NATO alliance. Now, we can get inside the data. I mean, there's a lot of the US 70% has nothing to do with Europe, right? We'd be spending it even if there weren't a NATO ally, a NATO alliance. But the reality is you had this 70%, 30% differentiation. The only thing that actually changed that dynamic was Putin's invasion of Ukraine the last time in 2014. And at the Wales summit in 2014, just months after Crimea and the Donbass and Baghdadi declaring the Islamic State Caliphate in Mosul, NATO leaders, for the first time, took a decision that they would aim at 2% of national GDP as the target for defense spending. So how are we doing? At the time, by the way, there were only 4 allies who were at 2%. Today, I think the number is 14 allies out of 30. Not bad progress, right? But what's really telling is that in the 7 years since the Wales Pledge, there's been, among European allies, so set aside US spending, among European NATO allies, 7 consecutive years of real growth, so growth exceeding inflation. And the result is hundreds of billions of additional dollars, euros, as it turns out, invested in defense. I think, so that's real progress. Sometimes as a former NATO ambassador, especially because I served under Obama, I'll take a question of, well, who's more responsible? The pledge was signed under Obama, but it was Trump who really just hammered allies publicly and, on television and so forth. I said, well, actually, it was neither of those presidents. It was another president, Putin, who's responsible for the Wales Pledge. And I think what we're going to see coming out of this experience, and this really relates directly to your question, David, is another surge in European defense capability. And the real ticket here will be if European investment, defense investment, is sufficient, I suppose that's redundant, is sufficient to turn on European defense industry. Because the real sector that suffered after the Cold War was that European industry retooled out of defense and into commercial lines. And that retooling of national industries is really what's required for European allies to take on more burden. But I think President Putin will once again prove to be the most vital impetus to European defense capabilities.
Constance, what do you think? I mean, will it be incremental shift? We'll get more NATO countries hitting the 2%, start up some new defense industries? Or do you think we're at a watershed in terms of European thinking about how much money it wants to spend on defense?
You know what? My answer to that is, unfortunately, it's really complicated. There are no headlines answers to this question. I will say this. Germany, for the past decade, until really the beginning of the pandemic, had a bumper government surplus. And a bumper national GDP. The result of which was that 2% would have been, I think, 50 billion euros, which would have required a doubling of our defense budget. That's actually technically quite difficult to do. You can't just, you can't just sort of pump the pipes with money and then come, spout tanks and fighter bombers out the other end.
And by the way, Constance, that's exactly what we tried to do in Afghanistan, by the way, right? Is to buy an army. And what we found is that you can't do that. So I absolutely agree with you.
Yeah, exactly. So that's one problem. The other problem is the deepening, the other two things, deepening path dependencies of military disinvestment, and at the same time, how do I put this? Product cycles speeding up, because even the pieces of military kit, as the Brits would say, that used to be just dumb metal are now all have some electronic component, right? And already 10 years ago, even the big three in Europe, the UK, the French, and the Germans, were no longer capable we're no longer able to afford, much less create at home, full spectrum armed forces that were at the level of technological superiority that the Americans had. So in other words, the electronic age in the defense industry has really deepened the wedge between the US and the European sort of military economies in a way that is almost irredeemable, or irremediable. Sorry, that's just a problem that is incredibly hard to fix, right? And one thing that the Germans had been thinking of before the onset of this new geopolitical age, with a great power with nuclear weapons threatening the European security order, and of course, behind it, the Chinese also trying to establish dominance in Europe through not through military means, but certainly through political bullying and sort of the buying up of physical and digital infrastructure. Think of the 5G, the Huawei trying to buy the 5G networks in Europe. And the Germans had been thinking about something called the Framework Nations concept, where for small to medium-sized operations, where the Americans, with every justification in the world, would be telling us, you got to do some things on your own. We would be, as sort of a major nation in Europe, attempting to replace the American forces backbone that we, for example, were not able to supply either in the Yugoslav wars or in the Libya operation. Yeah, that's something that we've actually been working on with smaller neighboring nations. Remember, Germany has borders with 9 nations, all of them except France, much smaller than we are, and who haven't been capable of having full spectrum forces for about 30 years. The Netherlands, are never going to have an aircraft carrier, right? Nor is Belgium. So we have actually been working really closely together with some of these small nations to provide, if not multilateral, then bilateral sort of joint units. And the closest of that military cooperation has been with the Dutch, but that's something that I think is really replicable on a larger scale. Now, as Doug and I were saying, the current dispensation, is blowing all that up in the air. And in this sort of new generation of German politicians that came into power thinking, okay, what we really need to do is to transform the German economy and make it more resilient with a view to anticipating the disruptions of climate change, and who thought that they could pursue a status quo foreign and security policy have just learned otherwise. And so now, to my, I have to say, astonishment, we are seeing all three parties in this unprecedented traffic light coalition currently saying, yep, we need a higher defense budget, let's do this. That's just a couple of days old. So no idea where this goes. But as I was saying at the outset, it's actually technically and in budgetary terms really quite difficult to do, to, as it were, pour in money at someone in a funnel at the top and have tanks and fighter bombers shoot out at the end. That's not how this works, sadly.
This is maybe a core issue. So if I may, just spend a couple more minutes.
Please.
It's really interesting. Yesterday, NATO leaders met virtually in a summit, right? So you got 30 television screens or whatever. And as a footnote, Sweden and Finland leaders joined this summit format along with the leadership of the EU. So anyway, there's this big summit happening, right? One of the key decisions coming out of this summit was the activation, for the first time ever, of what's called the NRF, the NATO Response Force. This is a 40,000 troop air, sea, land, special operations composite unit, the leadership of which rotates on an annual basis every year, right? This year, who's in the lead of the NRF? France, okay? Where does the lead brigade come from in the NATO Response Force today? It's a German-French composite unit, and it will soon be on the front edge of the NATO frontier. So it's kind of interesting that better than any exercise or any sort of tabletop war game, we're going to see in real life sort of a proof of concept here by way of the activation of the NATO Response Force. The other thing I want to highlight is the point that Constance mentioned, and this is a question of emerging technologies. If we're not careful, we will end up with two NATOs, with NATO comprised of one or two allies who have kept up with quantum computing, artificial intelligence, robotics, and so forth, and the others who have not. This really could provide a divide or a divisive function inside the alliance, which could erode decades of interoperability, our ability to operate alongside one another, because we'd end up with an alliance of haves and have-nots. So even if there were no Ukraine happening now, NATO faces this challenge of how will NATO as an alliance keep itself glued together operationally if some allies are much more advanced technologically than others.
Now, Doug, that's a medium-term concern, right? Because I have a question from Ron Bancroft, one of our participants in the conference, Cumberland, Maine, who points out that, I mean, God forbid, but we might need NATO to do something soon, depending on, if Russia does something really stupid. And we are talking about a division within NATO that would be of concern over some years. Would you say that NATO is ready to do what is necessary if called upon next week?
Yes, I'm talking about a more substantial technology divide down the road as these technologies really make their way into the mainstream of military operations. However, we should admit the NATO's had technological differentiation since the nuclear age, right? I mean, you only have 3 nuclear powers among the 30 members of NATO. You only have a handful of NATO members today, who have an offensive cyber capability. Yeah. So you've already got some differentiation. And NATO has been able to contend with those different levels of capabilities by way of protocols where the alliance calls on the nuclear powers, or the alliance has protocols that allow it to call on the offensive cyber powers in service of alliance objectives. I'm talking about, and maybe the question suggests, a more wholesome differentiation where artificial intelligence, quantum computing, robotics, and so forth really create a divide across alliance capabilities. And I guess in some ways it'd be a good divide because we'd like some capabilities, but it would really, I think, erode this notion of interoperability.
Dr. Stelzemüller, by the way, what makes you cringe?
It's David.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to ask, what makes you cringe less, Constance or Constanze? Which way?
You know what? I'm a foreign service brat, and my parents said when they were about to have children, our last name is a burden no matter what. So let's give the children first names that pronounce in different languages. So I don't care. I'm used to everything.
Yeah, well, with a name like Brancaccio, I'm hearing you there. Got the David, which helps.
People complicate Lute. I mean, it's 4 letters, single syllable, and I get all kinds of variants. So you shouldn't be.
Early in my career, on the radio, I was David Anthony, and people still said, "How do you spell that?" And I gave up. So one I ask is, I think it was Obama during his first campaign pointed out that the essence of leadership was being able to do more than one thing at a time. And you talked about the new German leadership is now newly focused on thinking about reinvesting in perhaps defense. But does that mean at the expense of the move toward renewable? That's one of the questions from V. Sheehan of Portland, Maine.
I don't think so, but I think that, look, Doug was exactly right when he said this is going to take many months. And the geopolitical and geoeconomic consequences of what is happening today are still completely incalculable. But let's not forget that we are all doing this in a moment of spiking gas prices and of rising inflation and of, still determined populist forces who view Western democracy as a system that needs to be destroyed, right? And who are perfectly capable of wanting to do that without Russian support, although they've been getting some of that too. So I think it's important to keep in mind that in general, the political capital and the sort of bandwidth of movement for the Biden administration, as much as for European government, is relatively narrow. And so the cost-benefit calculus of what we're about to do to punish or to further deter the Kremlin in its actions has to be exquisitely precise. And sorry, that sort of contextual framing was important to answer your question, because I think what that means is that this new German government needs to, at the same time, reassure its constituents who voted for it, not least because they felt that the previous chancellor in her 16 years had omitted to set in motion transformational changes in the way German governance works and German climate governance and energy policy works, had in fact allowed the continuing sort of snarl up of German energy policy to continue. So yes, they need to move on that, but they, at the same time, I think what they can say is, if we don't manage to deter autocrats who are determined to upset the institutional or the security order of Europe, then frankly, climate transformation is not going to be worth talking about. So to come back to your Obama quote, we have to do a grown-up government, as this government is now finding out, has to be able to do both those difficult things at the same time. It's just where we are.
Doug, what's the role of, how do we think about China when it comes to US-European relations? Obviously, fingers are crossed. Your opening statement focused on that, about where is she exactly on the Ukraine situation, but there are places where the U.S. and Europe are quite close on worrying about access to Chinese markets and theft of intellectual property and so forth. So, as we're getting into the second year here of the Biden administration, where are we in thinking together about China?
Well, I think were it not for Putin's attack on Ukraine, the NATO summit in June in Madrid would have featured this question very centrally. I'm sure that the leaders would have had one session in sort of a day and a half full of meetings and flags and flowers and all that. They would have had one session committed to China. I'm not sure that's going to happen this time in the face of the war in Ukraine. NATO has begun to understand that it is in competition with China, whether it wants to be or not. I like to say that if you plot the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, literally with the sea routes, the land routes, and so forth, right? And you ask, well, what is all this about? In my view, it's about the Western European market economy. The destination for the Belt and Road Initiative is not Turkmenistan. Okay, it's just not. Sorry, it is Western Europe with about a quarter of the world's GDP, a billion people, and a flourishing market, which is already dependent on China as a trade partner. So with that commercial infiltration into the Western Europe marketplace, and Constance mentioned Huawei, so telecommunications is a big sector here, the transportation sector is another, the energy sector is another, and the Greek deep sea port of Piraeus is owned by the Chinese today, right? So why would China be doing all this? And I think quite honestly, they don't have a military objective in mind right now. They see this as commercial infiltration. They imagine that with commercial influence, they will be able to rely on political influence downstream. So they're first infiltrating commercially, right, economically, with an expectation that they can count on supporting political votes downstream. We've seen some of this already by way of votes objecting to EU moves and so forth that were largely pinned on where the Chinese position was. I think NATO's got to come to grips with this, because the same civilian infrastructure that the Chinese are infiltrating are actually dual purpose infrastructure. So ports, railroads, 5G communications networks are not single purpose commercial only enterprises. These are the same ports, railways, and telecommunications that our military depends on. Now we add some pluses and minuses with security arrangements and so forth, but we don't have two railroad systems. We don't have two sets of ports. We have one. So NATO, I think, has got to come to grips with at least acknowledging Chinese influence on the European continent and then figuring out what to do about it. I don't think that NATO would extend that concern about China to a military presence outside of NATO's boundaries. So in the South China Sea, for example, or in the Pacific. But what I can imagine is Europe assuming more of the burden for European security and defense, not excluding the United States, but shifting the balance there, which then allows the US to rebalance in a military dimension to Asia and the Pacific. Early in the first Obama administration, it's a notion of the pivot to Asia. And our European allies didn't like that term pivot. It perhaps doesn't translate so well. It doesn't even translate so well in English, actually, because it suggests, you're in one position, but you're departing that position, you're going elsewhere. I one time asked President Obama about this. I said, hey, Bosch, you're killing us here with this term pivot. And he said, yeah, but you're a basketball player. Don't you understand what a pivot is? A pivot in basketball means that one of your feet stays firmly fixed while you move direction and pivot with the other foot. But you always have a pivot foot, one that stays firm. And for Obama, that was Europe. It was the transatlantic relationship, which was the steady anchor point of his pivot. any rate, the Biden administration now talks about the rebalance to Asia, and maybe that's a better term, but you get the idea. In either one of these terms, whichever you end up using, the notion that Europe is going to need to do more for itself, which permits the US not to leave Europe, because there will be, because of the sorts of things we've talked about, high-end enablers, emerging technology capabilities, and so forth, that the US still provides, right? It will still be the nuclear umbrella for the alliance, right? But allows the US with other capabilities like naval capabilities, air capabilities, and so forth, to increasingly pay attention to the competition with China. So I think it's a bit inevitable that China is going to enter into this equation. It may not make its own separate meeting in Madrid in June, but it will play an important part of the years ahead for NATO.
Constance, Europe has its own special relationship with China, but so does Mr. Putin.
Yeah, well, true. So two things. There is yes, we are seeing the Russians trying to align themselves with the Chinese. But the truth is that the Russians and the Chinese have a radically different take on Europe. The real threat to Putin from Ukraine and from Europe is democratic transformation. It's not NATO encirclement or any such bullshit. Forgive my language. It's democracy. And there was never going to be an inclusive European security order with Russia in it, at least not as long as Russia was run by Vladimir Putin. Because we're now finding out that Putin doesn't want an order. What he wants is disorder. What he wants is a failure of democracy, and what he wants is a failure of cohesion. Because that's what he can exploit and what helps him to legitimize an increasingly dysfunctional form of governance at home. He's just hideously badly mismanaged this pandemic. He's currently, it seems to me, quite badly managing this military campaign, which is not to say he cannot still do a great deal of damage. But the reports that we're seeing of unhappy recruits, of tanks breaking down on the road because they're lacking fuel, suggest that there's something going on there that can't have been quite the Kremlin's idea of, if you'll forgive the comparison, but I think it's actually apt here, a blitzkrieg against Ukraine. It is not currently turning out to be a blitzkrieg. Whereas the Chinese actually need not just Europe to be reasonably stable and prosperous, but they need the European Union because they need the single market. And they need the single physical and digital infrastructure space for their purposes, not just the Belt and Road project, but also, I think, for their purposes of political dominance vis-a-vis America. We're a pawn in either case, in their view, but in Russia, it would be, in the Russian view, it would be a destroyed pawn, and the Chinese need a functioning pawn. It's a big difference.
Yeah, this is absolutely the key point. Putin is playing a game of disruption. Xi depends on a reliable international system, which he then intends to take advantage of.
Exactly.
Right? But he has fueled the last 20 years of progress. The Communist Party in China has fueled that 20 years of progress and the creation of a Chinese middle class, which now they have to respond to, right? The government has to respond to that middle class based on the existing rules of the road. Now, China will fudge the rules, press the margins, and so forth, but they don't want to disrupt this system, which has created the last 20 years of progress.
I do have another point, a final one, if I may.
Oh, sorry.
That, what Doug is outlining is a sort of a functional division of labor between America and Europe vis-a-vis China. I think in military terms, I think is absolutely, what it's going to be. But again, just as in this confrontation with Russia, non-military means are going to be much more important than they used to be. Because it turns out that autarky is not an option. I mean, this is something that parts of the Trump, not even every part. I mean, I think Stephen Mnuchin didn't think that, but Peter Navarro certainly did. Thought that America could be economically autarkic and didn't, could dial back integration, bring back value chains, exclude migration, from the American economy, and none of that turned out to be particularly, successful economic policy. Whereas what we are looking at is, I think, a world in which, if only because of technology, we're going to see deepened integration, which, however, doesn't produce peace, love, and kumbaya for everybody, but increased friction. And we need to figure out how to manage that in such a way as to not let it be weaponized against us. And in that framing, Europe's and the European Union's economic and technological power is, I would say, also essential to American purposes. We're not just a nice to have, we're essential, because American military power alone isn't going to cut it. And so in that sense, bizarrely, the learning experience of this particular crisis is that when you are dealing with ruthless, and I would say in the case of Putin, increasingly erratic and irrational great powers with nuclear weapons, not only are we not islands, we need each other and each other's complementary capabilities to provide not just diplomacy, but also deterrence, defense, and resilience. I think that's a really important insight from this crisis, and it kind of shows that we're, as a transatlantic space, joined at the hip right now, and I think will remain so in the future. And that has consequences for our politics. Sorry, Doug.
Clausewitz has a great term for this, right? Center of gravity, right? And he talks about what is the core essential thing a enterprise, either a nation or an alliance, must guard. And that's the center of gravity. And to Constance's point, for NATO, that is coherence. It is solidarity. That's what we have to guard against. We have to guard that and protect that as a vital interest.
All the students listening are just wrote down Clausewitz, and they're going to impress their professors.
It's a tough read.
By the way, you mentioned that
it's
all
tough
these...
in German. Can I just say that?
Yeah, I can only imagine. We have our German allies to thank for this, right?
Yeah, exactly. By the way, Constance, your mention of these webs that bind us through globalization also cause friction. We got a whole panel on that coming up in about in less than an hour. So we'll talk more about that. So when you mentioned Navarro, it reminds me that we have a question here from Eric Sass of Sedgwick, Maine. It's about, do we pay at all any attention to President Trump's views on Mr. Putin in the recent days? The question is, how will Trump and Pompeo's support of Putin? I hadn't seen the Pompeo statement.
Oh, God, we can, yeah.
Really? How might that impact the transatlantic alliance in the long term? Is it a sideshow? Does it matter?
I think it's interesting. So there's some other populist movements among the 30 democracies in NATO, right? And here you think Mr. Orban, the Kaczynski party in Poland. I don't know if he's a populist, but he's an autocrat with Erdogan in Turkey and so forth. All of them, by the way, have come together and were at the summit yesterday and voted for the activation of the NATO response force and so forth. So NATO has been sort of has had a cohering effect, even among the populists inside the NATO alliance. Look, as an American citizen, I hope that one of the good outcomes of this conflict will be the debunking of the populist fascination and fixation and attending to Vladimir Putin. This could be, if there's a silver lining here, it could be that it reveals that part of the populist narrative for what it is, which is, crazy, disjointed, and misplaced allegiance to an autocratic leader. So I'm forever hopeful.
Constance, did it matter when Trump has an opinion like this out of office?
I'm of two minds about that. It's distressing to see not just the former president, but his former Secretary of State. Not just saying we have to take him seriously, which we should, but praise him when he's attacking a free and sovereign NATO nation like Ukraine and endangering NATO. I mean, to me, that is just mind-boggling. I cannot see that there is any excuse for that. And honestly,
it's going to be very hard to pivot away from that narrative. It's going to be very hard for them to. They will not be forgiven.
If I may just use a phrase that is, it's un-American. I'm sorry. It's just an un-American thing to do. And it's just, I mean, that's not to say that there aren't a lot of Putin-Versteher notoriously in my country, right? There are. But honestly, I will say this. I was last Sunday, less than a week ago, on a German evening primetime show, something like, the German equivalent of Meet the Nation, with a senior leader and former party chair of Die Linke, which is the hard right, former communist party of East and West Germany, who was, saying Putin will never attack, and we provoked him, yada yada yada, and ultimately the rest of us said, you're what you're saying is just insane, and it's sad and embarrassing, and according to news reports, she had to justify herself and apologize in an internal meeting of her parliamentary group. That's unheard of. That is literally unheard of. The Die Linke, which is on the left end of the spectrum, used to be, not in its entirety, but publicly pretty hardline, pro whatever the Kremlin says. And you actually now have people in the leadership going out and saying, of course, Russia is the aggressor. Of course, there need to be sanctions. And there is no call to be making any kind of apology for this. So, this may not be a very relevant mountain, but it certainly is a moving mountain.
Doug, Kenneth Hillas of Orno certainly noted it when you mentioned that the Finns and the Swedes were at that meeting. And there's talk of their possible NATO membership. And he poses in the question, he said Putin this week warned both countries against joining NATO. If they should want to actually join outright, should the US and Europeans issue them some kind of invitation? Or is that, the question is that too provocative?
Well, the way this works, it has always worked. Since the original 12 members of the alliance, over the decades, we've expanded to 30, right? So we've more than doubled size of NATO over time. In every instance, joining NATO started as a national decision. So it has to start in the national capital, whether that's Kyiv, Helsinki, or wherever, right? So the first question is that what the Finnish and the Swedish people want? And what are their internal political mechanisms for making such a binding bid? Once the nation decides, they formally come to the alliance, and then Article 10 of the Washington Treaty kicks in. It takes effect, right? And Article 10 is about 3 or 4 sentences long. It simply says that there are 3 criteria for membership. First of all, it's open to any European state. So it was really interesting, right? So confining NATO membership or somehow restricting membership would actually be in violation of the Washington Treaty. So as Constance mentioned early on, the demands that NATO restrict membership in any way, in this case, most immediate case with regard to Ukraine, would actually involve violating the treaty, which makes no sense. And that's why from the outset it was off the table. But any European state who represents the principles of the alliance, and here these are the democratic principles stated in the preamble. So democracy, individual liberty, rule of law. So that's criteria 1. Criteria 2 is can contribute to the collective defense. And clearly Sweden and Finland are, if nothing more, geographically positioned in the Nordic area on the Baltic Sea to contribute to the collective defense. Plus they have meaningful military capability as well. And this is the catch, right? And then the membership decision will be taken at the alliance. And in order to be approved, must be agreed at full consensus. So today the vote would have to be 30-0, right? So if you imagine, this beginning in Sweden and Finland, reaching the alliance table. I think I would be optimistic that Sweden and Finland would meet those basic criteria of Article 10 of the treaty and would be welcomed into the alliance. But the key here, David, is it's got to start with them.
It's got to start from them. Yeah.
Can I add something?
Yeah.
Or do you want to go on with questions?
No, please.
Yeah. So two things. The Finns and the Swedes probably sort of contribute more to NATO as non-NATO members than they would than do some members, right? They are ultra good 3 gold star partners. Is one thing. And the Russians, nonetheless, including quite recently, have been making threatening noises, saying there will be consequences for you should you consider joining. The upshot of that was, I think yesterday, the NATO Secretary General and the Finns and the Swedes agreeing to increase their intelligence sharing. In other words, the Russians are really scoring one own goal after the other, right? This is amazing. Swedish and Finnish public, the posture of most parties and public opinion has been sort of inching towards maybe this would not be a bad idea before the Russian aggression. But it was always sort of very, held back. Let's not move too quickly here. We're Scandinavians. We like taking things slowly. But, a couple more, more stupid stuff from the Russians, and this could decisively shift, I think. The more tricky question is, would it have made sense, or would it make sense now? Did it ever make sense to offer a membership action plan to Georgia and Ukraine? And would this be a good thing now? And I have to say, I'm really ambivalent on this for the simple reason that we have, I think, always constructed this as a binary. In other words, and the conditions for membership, both in NATO and especially the EU, have always been really quite onerous, particularly joining the European Union, which is not an alliance, but an actual sort of system of laws and rules with functioning institutions that are supranational, is really quite burdensome. And if you have a fragile governance, that is not terribly functional, which I think we already saw in the last round of EU enlargement with Romania and Bulgaria, that undertaking that sort of really drastic institutional transformation can, while it brings obvious benefits, also be a real burden, and something that is really hard for a developing country with a transforming economy and democracy to integrate. And so I think what we've learned from those earlier enlargement processes, just talking about the EU right now, I'll come to NATO, has been that we actually need something that is less one size fits all and needs to be much more sort of carefully tailored and perhaps drawn out to permit a homegrown transformation rather than something which we sort of say, you either do 100% of this or you do nothing. And with NATO, I would say, I think that in the past, we haven't paid enough attention to whether a country was a functioning democracy. And during the Cold War, we didn't, and we didn't have to. So we took in the Greek junta and the Turks when they were under military rule and so on. But I think it is increasingly important to make that distinction. And we've seen that, especially with democratic rollbacks in some European countries, most egregiously Hungary. Now, the Hungarians are currently really quite remarkably and sort of enthusiastically towing the line on both on EU sanctions and on NATO actions, despite the fact that they have been in the past notably pro-Russian in their rhetoric and in their policy. So I guess stuff changes, but when faced with a determined aggressor. But these things aren't. There's an awful lot of public grandstanding going on right now about the need to get Ukraine into EU and NATO now. And all I'm saying is, this isn't easy. And it should be, if it's done, it should be done in a way that, is something the country can digest and the institution taking it in can digest. And these absorption questions are really important in economic terms, political, democratic, and military terms, and need to be considered very carefully. My position on this has always been, we must never, ever say we won't do it. bottom line in Europe has to be, we will never say no, but we will work with you to help you transform in such a way that at the end of that process, the question answers itself, right? That's my ideal framing. But right now, I think it's, I mean, we don't know yet what the Russians are still willing to do. And I have to say, I'm extremely pessimistic. And I want to say this before we leave this. I want to say that I have some very bad fears as to what Putin is still capable of doing, not just in Ukraine, but vis-a-vis NATO member states and on NATO's eastern flank. And I think we really do need to continue to be prepared for the worst. And that will, this managing and coming alive out of this crisis will, I think, be our top priority for the next weeks and months. And it will require all the resolve, the strength that we have.
Yeah, let me just come on that last point. I absolutely agree that, again, when we're in the face of a crisis and we're living it every day, we imagine that somehow we have to just resolve this, manage it to a successful conclusion, and we can move on to the next. That's not how this is going to play. I mean, if current trends persist, President Putin has underestimated the problems he will have in Ukraine, first in seizing power, then in controlling the population. I think he has overestimated his buffed up, sort of polished up military capability. There are some fundamental indicators of this on the ground in Ukraine, even in the first 72 hours of this campaign, that suggest that he's got an overly optimistic view of his military capabilities. And if these trends persist, he is facing a loss. He's facing a defeat, or at a minimum, a long-term open wound, bleeding ulcer in Ukraine. And I'm not sure how that plays out for him domestically. So if he's pressed into a corner, as I'm suggesting, I think everything is on the table. And we should remember, he's got 6,000 nuclear weapons. I don't mean a massive attack, but I think we need to remember that. We need to think about that. And we need to imagine 1, 2, or 3 steps beyond today, what the potential consequences are. Another possible escalatory ladder we could get ourselves on is cyber. He surprisingly has not employed much cyber to date in Ukraine, at least during the offensive, right? But if he does, what we know about cyber attacks is that they don't respect geographic boundaries. So a cyber attack meant for Ukraine that spills over and shuts down the lights in Poland, for example, could result in pulling NATO into a cyber conflict that it never intended to be in. And who knows where that leads. So all kinds of downstream dangers here that we're going to need to navigate.
A question from Bob Baldwin in Rockport. It's an invitation really to reflect on recent history. The question is, how can Putin believe he can recreate some kind of Soviet empire or recreate the Soviet Union by invading neighboring countries when those invasions create these resentments in the population? It can be done. It's not, the history shows that you can topple governments and have a longer standing influence. The United States has, in its history, also tried those tactics. What should we say to Bob about prospects for using force to reestablish Russian dominance in other countries?
Not sure I understand. Do you think prospects for Russia using force towards regime change in other countries?
Yeah, the question seems to sort of reflect on it must be impossible to gain strategic advantage through military gains in other countries. But the fact is it can work.
Yeah, but I don't think the history gives you great prospects. I mean, the combination, think about this recipe that Putin is in. So an attempt by external aggression at regime change, right, with an internal resistance. What's the track record for those ingredients coming together and rendering success? I think he underestimated several factors there. He underestimated the Ukrainian resistance, and I believe he overestimated his ability to produce a quick result. This has not been quick or clean. The fact that he has only deployed about 1/3 of the forces that he amassed along the Ukrainian border is telling. I think it reveals that he expected the 1/3 that he did deploy to be sufficient. He thought this is going to be quick. And I don't know of a recent experience where this set of ingredients resulted in success on the battlefield. So I think he's enough. What will his response be? It won't be to simply withdraw. He's going to go in with the iron fist. And I think, I can imagine a Chechnya-like brutal, absolutely brutal response in opposition to the Ukrainian resistance. And we should expect that.
2 points here. There have been pictures of Russians mustering a large Chechen armed unit to send to Ukraine. And the other thing is we shouldn't forget that Putin 2 days ago, I think, threatened the West implicitly with the use of nuclear weapons, thereby breaking a sort of standard of civilization that has held so far since 1945, or shall I say 1946. And that is an astounding breach of civilizational protocol, for want of a better expression. I'm also being sent information by a friend right now saying Russians are moving troops to the Polish border in Belarus. And there's a lot of ways in which this could go wrong, even if none of the things that I've just hinted at come to pass. I mean, just imagine, the Ukrainians putting up a determined insurgents, being pursued by Russian troops. They get pushed up against the border of a NATO member state. The member state opens that border, lets in Ukrainian troops. Russians try to enter in hot pursuit, are repelled by NATO member state troops. Yeah, Poles send up fighter bombers, whatever. Yeah. This could turn into an Article 5 operation in a flash.
Or another scenario would be the NATO resupply columns with the anti-tank systems and anti-air systems. So in the US jargon, javelins and stingers, which I believe have probably proven quite successful against the Russian troops, right? That these resupply columns, which would be coming from probably Romania and Poland, right? That Russia takes the fight to the resupply effort. That could easily spill across the geographic boundaries.
Third scenario could be, and we're actually seeing that in social media already. You have hundreds of thousands, millions of internally displaced persons and refugees. The Russians start attacking them, shooting at them. We're mounting a full-scale humanitarian relief effort, and then there is an international outcry, and people demand no-fly zones, military support, protection for humanitarian aid coming into Ukraine, et cetera, et cetera. There's multiple ways which we've experienced, particularly in the Yugoslav wars, in which this becomes a standoff between the West and a great power with nuclear weapons. And again, I think it's really important to emphasize here that we have seen, I think, a Kremlin leader who is, to use an American vernacular expression, appears to be well ahead of his skis. But somebody who is well ahead of his skis can bring down a mountain in an avalanche. This is, if you'll forgive my saying this as a German, appears to be notably inclined now to use terms from World War II, talking about genocide falsely lying about genocide in Ukraine, and saying that Ukrainians should resist their government because it needs to be denazified. If he in his mind is refighting World War II, you know, then all I can say is we need to buckle up.
I'm glad we talked.
Sorry about that. Yeah, this is no fun.
Well, no. This is crucial. In the last couple of minutes, let me just ask. I'll start with Doug. How do we build on this new this new level of cooperation between the U.S. and Europe that we've seen in recent weeks in relationship to the to this Ukraine situation? You've seen, you detailed a nice fluidity of sharing of intelligence, for instance, and working with allies in a way that we haven't seen in some years. But there must be sort of thoughts about next steps to leverage that, not just to respond to Ukraine, but just to nurture the transatlantic relationship. Any thoughts on that?
Well, because I think we're at a high water mark in terms of consultation and the power of diplomacy. I suppose the short answer would be simply to aim to sustain this level of consultation and so forth. And you mentioned, or one of us mentioned, intelligence sharing. That's certainly a piece of it. I think the NATO alliance is going to take on a burden for the humanitarian assistance of what I fear will be several million, maybe multiple million Ukrainians who seek refuge in NATO states, right? I mean, the natural flow out of Ukraine to the west is into Romania and Slovakia and Poland. And so it may be that the NATO response force, for example, has a more important humanitarian assistance role with regard to helping these national governments with the refugee crisis than it does an immediate combat role. But I think the bottom line is diplomacy, intelligence sharing, burden sharing that contributes to solidifying, gluing together, cohering the NATO alliance is the ticket here. And there should be a relentless campaign to continue what we've been doing over the last 2 months.
Yes to all that. May I just also give a shout out to end with to all the brave Russians who have been painting targets on their backs by protesting either in social media or on the streets against the Kremlin's heinous attack on Ukraine. I find that remarkable. And one of those are people, a couple of those are people I know and consider friends. I think their actions are admirable, and I can only hope that we can help protect them.
Well, thank you. I'm not really a drinking man, but I think it's time to get a scotch, even though it's early in the day. There are a lot of headlines out of our interaction today, and I think that everyone here in the conference will have not just food for thought, but also can now spread the word about just the level of what's at stake here, in case it wasn't appreciated an hour and a half ago. I think it is now. Constanze, Doug, thank you very much. And we'll hear more from them as the conference goes on as part of some of the Q&A that we have arranged for later, including tomorrow.